The fluorescent lights of the compliance office hummed with a sterile, hypnotic indifference, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Arthur's chest. For 15 years, he had been the guardian of his father's reputation, the silent architect of a medical empire that promised healing to thousands. But tonight, the spreadsheet glowing on his monitor whispered a different story, a story of data points manipulated like pawns on a chessboard and safety margins, shaved thin to fatten the quarterly dividends. Each cell he highlighted felt like a cold stone added to a mounting pile of betrayal, a ledger of lies written in the ink of corporate greed and signed with the name he shared. The silence of the empty building wasn't a comfort. It was a deafening witness to the exact moment his reality fractured into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. He remembered his father, Dr. Silas Vance, standing on stages across the globe, a paragon of ethics and medical innovation who had built this company from a garage to a skyscraper. Silas wasn't just a CEO. He was a patriarch whose word was law in their household, and a beacon of hope for patients suffering from chronic pain. Yet, the encrypted files Arthur had accidentally unearthed revealed a darker architecture beneath the philanthropy. Reports of liver toxicity were buried, and whistleblowers within the labs were silenced with non-disclosure agreements and golden parachutes. This wasn't a mistake or a statistical anomaly. It was a calculated sacrifice of human lives for the sake of a legacy that Arthur had spent his entire adult life trying to uphold and eventually inherit. The weight of the pivot began to crush his lungs as he thought of his younger sister, Claire, whose upcoming wedding was being funded by the very dividends those falsified trials produced. To speak out was to bankrupt her future, to humiliate his father in the twilight of his career, and to turn himself into a pariah at the dinner table where they had once laughed about a shared future. But to stay silent was to be an accomplice in every funeral that would follow the release of the new medication, a shadow partner in a crime that traded breath for gold. He sat in the darkness, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat, demanding he choose between the sanctity of blood and the cold, unyielding demand of the truth. Arthur's hand hovered over the external drive icon, his fingers trembling with the realization that once he clicked, the Vance family name would become synonymous with scandal rather than salvation. He looked at the framed photo on his desk of him and his father at his graduation, Silas's hand heavy and proud on his shoulder, a hand that now felt like a shackle. The air in the room grew thin, as if the walls themselves were closing in to protect the secrets they had guarded for decades. Every second of hesitation was a second where his soul was being bargained away, a slow erosion of the man he thought he was in favor of the man his family expected him to be. This was the precipice, the sharp edge of a moral cliff where the wind of consequence screamed in a language only he could understand. There was no middle ground, no compromise that could save both his family's honor and his own integrity. One had to die so the other could live. As the city lights flickered through the window, mocking his indecision with their distant, uncaring glow, Arthur felt the final tether snap. He realized that the silence he had kept for so long was no longer a shield, but a cage, and the key was a truth that would set him free only by burning his world to the ground. The pivot was here, and the descent was about to begin. Welcome to the moral pivot, where we explore the gut-wrenching moments when a single choice defines the soul of a human being. Today, we stand in the shadows of a medical dynasty, watching as a son discovers that the man he idolized is an architect of deception. It is a story that asks the most terrifying question of all. Is your loyalty to your own flesh and blood worth the price of an innocent stranger's life? This isn't a fairy tale of clear-cut heroes and villains, but a descent into the grey reality where doing the right thing might mean losing everything you have ever loved. We are about to witness the collapse of the Vance Empire, not from the outside, but from the very heart that kept it beating. As we dive into this labyrinth of secrets and shadows, I want to personally invite you to become part of our growing community of thinkers. If you find value in narratives that challenge your perspective and go beneath the surface of human behavior, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a pivot. Your support is the fuel that allows us to craft these deep, investigative stories that honor the complexity of the human condition. If this story moves you, or if you've ever faced a choice that felt impossible, like this video to help us reach more people who value truth over comfort. We are truly a global channel, and we believe that morality is a conversation that transcends borders. We would be honored if you would leave a comment below telling us which country and city you are watching from. Whether you are in a quiet village in the mountains or a pulsing metropolis by the sea, your presence here matters. We read your insights and locations with great interest, as it reminds us that while our cultures may differ, the weight of a guilty conscience is a burden we all understand. Your engagement helps us build a bridge between different perspectives on justice and family. Now, return with me to that darkened office, where the hum of the computer is the only sound in a building built on lies. Arthur Vance has made his decision, but the execution of that choice is far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The drive is in his pocket, the security cameras are watching, and the man he calls father is just a phone call away. Pay close attention, because in the world of the moral pivot, the hardest part isn't finding the truth, it's living with the consequences of revealing it. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of a Betrayal. The drive in Arthur's pocket felt like a burning coal against his leg as he walked through the marble lobby of Vance Pharmaceuticals for what he knew would be the last time as an ally. The security guard, a man named Leo, who had seen Arthur grow from a curious boy into a focused executive, gave him a friendly nod that Arthur couldn't bring himself to return. Every step on the polished stone floor echoed like a gavel, pronouncing a sentence he had yet to fully comprehend. He reached his car, a sleek vehicle bought with the profits of the very deception he now carried, and sat in the dark for a long time before starting the engine. He drove aimlessly through the city, the neon signs of pharmacies and clinics mocking him with their promises of health and care. He kept seeing the faces of the trial participants from the Phase 3 documents, real people with names, families, and hopes, whose declining health had been erased by a few strokes of a keyboard. His father had always said that the greater good requires a steady hand, but Arthur now saw that the steady hand was simply one that didn't tremble while committing fraud. The realization that his luxury was funded by the suffering of others made the leather seats of his car feel like thorns. When he finally arrived at his apartment, he didn't turn on the lights, preferring the honest gloom to the artificial brightness of his life. He sat at his kitchen table, the external drive plugged into his laptop, staring at the files that would dismantle his father's world. He knew the legal ramifications. His father would face prison, the company would fold, and thousands of employees would lose their jobs. The collateral damage was immense, a tidal wave of ruin that he was about to unleash with a single upload button. He thought of the many Sunday dinners where his father spoke of integrity and the Vance legacy while cutting the roast beef with surgical precision. Was it all a performance? Or had Silas Vance convinced himself that his lies were a necessary sacrifice for the survival of his company? Arthur struggled to reconcile the man who had tucked him in at night with the man who had signed off on the suppression of liver failure reports. The cognitive dissonance was a physical pain, a tearing of the mind that left him feeling hollow and adrift. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the table. the screen illuminating the dark room with a call from Dad. Arthur stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't answer, watching until the screen went dark, only for a text message to appear seconds later. "Arthur, come by the house tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the expansion plans for the new wing. Proud of you, son." The words felt like a physical assault, a manipulative reminder of the bond he was about to sever forever. He spent the rest of the night reading through the suppressed testimonies of the lab technicians who had tried to speak up. They were ordinary people who had been crushed by the Vance legal machine, their careers ruined and their voices silenced by threats. Arthur felt a kinship with them now, a shared burden of knowledge that made his previous life feel like a distant, shallow dream. He realized that his father hadn't just built a company, he had built a fortress of fear to protect a throne of lies. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, Arthur's eyes were bloodshot and his resolve was a cold, hard diamond. He hadn't slept, but he had never felt more awake in his entire life. He knew that the moment he stepped into his father's house that morning, the pivot would be complete. He packed a small bag with his essentials, knowing he might not be coming back to this apartment or this life ever again. The Vance estate was a sprawling masterpiece of glass and steel, perched on a hill like a crown over the city. As Arthur pulled into the driveway, the morning sun glinted off the windows, making the house look like a beacon of success rather than a mausoleum of secrets. He found his father on the terrace, sipping coffee and reading a medical journal, looking every bit the statesman of science the world believed him to be. Silas looked up and smiled, a warm, genuine expression that almost made Arthur turn around and run. "Arthur, you look like you haven't slept," Silas said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "The expansion is a big undertaking, I know, but you're more than ready to lead it." Arthur sat down, the weight of the drive in his pocket feeling heavier than the entire house. He didn't touch the coffee the maid placed in front of him, his throat too tight to swallow even a drop of water. He looked at his father, searching for a trace of guilt or hesitation in those familiar eyes, but found only the calm of a man who believed he was untouchable. "I found the Phase 3 files, Dad," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady whisper that cut through the chirping of the morning birds. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, a sudden drop in pressure that made the air feel heavy. Silas didn't move, his gaze remaining fixed on his journal for a heartbeat too long before he slowly lowered it. The smile didn't vanish. It simply transformed into a mask of professional concern, a practiced shift he had used 1,000 times in boardrooms. "Those files are internal working documents, Arthur," Silas replied, his voice smooth and paternal. "They contain raw data that hasn't been properly contextualized by the senior team yet." Arthur felt a spark of anger light up in his chest, a heat that replaced the cold dread of the night before. "I am the senior compliance officer, Dad. I am the one who contextualizes them, and there is no context where burying patient deaths is acceptable." Silas leaned forward, the warmth in his eyes replaced by the cold, calculating steel of a CEO protecting his borders. "Listen to me very carefully, son. We are on the verge of a breakthrough that will cure millions. If this drug is delayed or cancelled because of a few unfortunate outliers, those millions will continue to suffer. Is that the truth you want to protect? The truth of a few at the expense of the many?" It was the classic utilitarian trap, the same logic that had paved the road to this moral graveyard. Arthur shook his head, the manipulation no longer working on him. "You're not saving millions, Dad. You're saving your stock price and your ego. Those people weren't outliers. They were human beings who trusted you. Silas slammed his hand on the table, the silver clattering against the china, the first crack in his composed facade. Everything I built for you and Claire. This lifestyle, your future, it all depends on the strength of this company. Do you want to be the one who burns your sister's house down? The mention of Claire was a low blow, a deliberate attempt to weaponize Arthur's love for his family against his sense of justice. Arthur looked at the house, the gardens, and the luxury that surrounded them, seeing it now for what it truly was, a bribe. He realized that Silas hadn't just given him a life, he had bought his silence in advance, and the price was his soul. Claire deserves to know that her brother isn't a coward, Arthur said, standing up. Silas stood as well, his stature still commanding, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. If you walk out that door with those files, you are no longer a Vance. You will be a traitor to this family. And I will use every resource I have to ensure you never work in this industry again. You will have the truth, Arthur, but you will have nothing else. No family, no career, no future. Think very carefully before you pivot. Arthur didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked away, the sound of his father's heavy breathing following him like a curse. As he drove away from the estate, he felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration, as if he had finally stepped out of a long, dark tunnel. He didn't go to the police yet. He went to a small, nondescript hotel on the edge of town and checked in under a false name. He needed a few hours to organize the evidence, to ensure that once the fire was lit, it couldn't be extinguished by his father's influence. The next 48 hours were a descent into a digital war zone. Arthur began leaking the documents to a trusted investigative journalist he had known from college, a man who wouldn't be bought or intimidated. As the first reports began to hit the wire, Arthur's phone became a weapon of psychological warfare. His sister Claire called him 50 times, her voice shifting from confusion to anger to hysterical tears as she realized her world was ending. "How could you do this to us?" She screamed into the voicemail. "You've destroyed everything. Dad is in the hospital with chest pains because of you." The guilt was a suffocating blanket, a constant reminder that his integrity had a body count of its own. He sat in the dimly lit hotel room, watching the news cycle explode with the Vance Pharmaceuticals scandal. He saw his father being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of dignified outrage, even as the evidence of his crimes was laid bare for the world to see. The company's stock plunged, thousands of families lost their livelihoods in an afternoon, and the name Vance became a global synonym for corporate evil. Arthur was no hero in the eyes of the public. He was the rat who had waited 15 years to speak up, the man who had enjoyed the fruits of the crime before turning on his own father. The comments on social media were a vitriolic storm, with half the world calling for his head and the other half questioning his motives. He was a man without a country, rejected by his family and viewed with suspicion by the very society he had tried to protect. The truth was a cold, lonely companion that offered no comfort in the dark of the night. One evening, a private investigator hired by his father's legal team tracked him down to the hotel. They didn't offer a bribe, they offered a threat. "Your father has friends you don't even know about, Arthur," the man said through the half-opened door. "This won't end with a trial. You've broken the first rule of the elite. You don't turn on your own. You're a dead man walking." Arthur closed the door and locked it, but he knew the man was right. He had traded his safety for a clean conscience, and the debt was coming due. He spent his days in a fog of legal depositions and interviews with federal agents, repeating the same facts until they lost all meaning. He saw the photos of the victims again, and for the first time, He didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. He felt a quiet, somber peace. He had done what was required, and the cost was irrelevant because the alternative, living a lie, was no longer an option. He was broke, alone, and hated. But for the first time in 35 years, he was Arthur, not the son of Silas Vance. 6 months later, Arthur stood in a sterile visitation room at a federal prison, waiting for the man who had once been his entire world. Silas Vance looked older, his hair completely white and his once impeccable suits replaced by a shapeless orange jumpsuit. He sat down across from Arthur, the glass between them a physical manifestation of the chasm that now separated them. Silas didn't pick up the phone at first. He just stared at Arthur with a look of profound, icy disappointment. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was a rasp, stripped of its former power but still carrying the weight of a lifetime of command. "Was it worth it, Arthur? Claire is working in a diner to pay her rent. The house is gone. The legacy is a joke. All of that, for what? A few headlines and a pat on the back from a bunch of strangers who have already forgotten your name." It was the final attempt to make Arthur regret his pivot, the last gasp of a man who believed that loyalty to a person was higher than loyalty to a principle. Arthur looked at his father, and instead of anger, he felt a profound sense of pity. Silas was a man who had built a kingdom but lost his soul, a man who truly believed that a gilded lie was better than a painful truth. It was worth it because the families of those 12 people finally have an answer. "Dad," Arthur said softly. "And it was worth it because I don't have to look in the mirror and see your accomplice anymore." Silas let out a cold, hollow laugh. "You're still a child, Arthur. You think the world cares about your truth. The world cares about results. And I gave them results. You gave them nothing but ruins." He stood up, signaling the end of the visit, his eyes burning with a hatred that Arthur knew would never fade. "Don't come back. You're not my son. You're just a ghost in a world that has moved on without you." As Arthur walked out of the prison, the air felt crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stagnant, heavy atmosphere of the visitation room. He had no money, no family, and no clear future, but he had his name, not the name on the building, but the name written in the book of his own conscience. He took a deep breath, the pivot finally complete, the transition from a shadow to a man finally realized in the cold light of day. He walked to the bus station, his small bag in hand, ready to start over in a city where no one knew who he was. He had a job interview as a low-level clerk in a small non-profit, a far cry from the executive offices of Vance Pharmaceuticals, but it was honest work. As he sat on the bench waiting for his bus, he saw a woman reading a newspaper with a small headline about a new, safer medical regulation passed in the wake of the Vance scandal. It was a small victory, a tiny ripple in a vast ocean, but it was enough. The following November, Arthur sat in a small, cramped apartment in a city 300 miles away, eating a simple turkey sandwich alone. He looked at the empty chairs at his small table, imagining the lavish Thanksgiving feasts of his youth of fine wine, the silver platters, and the laughter that had felt so real but had been so hollow. He missed Claire's laugh and the way his father would tell stories of his travels. But he didn't miss the secrets that had always been the uninvited guests at those tables. He had received a letter from Claire a week before, the first communication in months. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a curse either. "I don't understand why you did it," she wrote, "and I don't know if I ever will. But I saw a mother on the news whose son survived because the new regulations caught a problem early. She was crying, Arthur. She looked like she finally had peace. Maybe that's what you wanted. I'm still angry, but I'm tired of hating you. It was a small crack in the wall of exile, a tiny hope that one day blood might find its way back to truth. The whistleblower's debt was a high one, a tax on his life that he would be paying for decades to come. He would never be rich again, never be powerful, and never be the golden boy of a dynasty. But as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, the hum of the heater the only sound in the room, he felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't known was possible. He had protected the truth, and in doing so, he had protected the only part of himself that actually mattered. The silence he kept now wasn't the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a man at peace. The pivot had been a violent, destructive act, a tearing down of a temple to save a soul. But as he looked out at the city lights, Arthur knew he would make the same choice 1,000 times over. He was no longer a Vance of the Empire. He was a man of his word, and that was the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away by a lawyer or a scandal. He finished his sandwich and walked to the window, watching the families below scurrying into their homes for the holiday. He knew that behind many of those doors, other silences were being kept and other secrets were being guarded. He hoped that if their moment ever came, they would have the strength to face their own pivot. For Arthur Vance, the debt was paid, the truth was out, and the family he had lost was the price he had been willing to pay to find himself. The night was cold, but the stars were clear, unburdened by the smog of deception that had once clouded his vision. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of spreadsheets or shadows. He was free, and in the world of the moral pivot, that was the greatest, most expensive victory of all. The silence was finally his own. We have reached the end of Arthur Vance's journey, a path paved with the wreckage of a dynasty and the quiet dignity of a reclaimed soul. His story serves as a powerful reminder that the most difficult decisions are often the ones that cost us the people we love most. In the end, Arthur chose a truth that isolated him, but it was a truth that saved lives he would never know and restored a conscience he had almost lost. It is a stark illustration that the pivot is rarely easy, but it is always necessary if we are to remain human in a world that values profit over people. As we conclude this episode of The Moral Pivot, I want to leave you with one final thought. If you were standing in that sterile office, holding the evidence that could destroy your family but save 1,000 strangers, would you have the courage to click upload? Or is the weight of blood too heavy to ever truly betray? These are the questions that define us when the lights go out and the world stops watching. Thank you for spending this time with us and for being part of this exploration into the deepest corners of human ethics. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who appreciates a narrative with weight and meaning. We will be back soon with another case, another life, and another impossible choice. Until then, keep questioning, keep reflecting, and remember, every life has a turning point. What will yours be? This has been The Moral Pivot. Good night.